This silent fusion of the pithless essentialities of the evaporated life has, however, still to be taken in the other meaning of the actuality of conscience and in the manifestation of its movement. Conscience has to be considered as acting. The objective moment in this consciousness acquired above the determination of a universal consciousness, the knowledge that knows itself is, qua this particular self, distinct from other selves, the language in which all reciprocally acknowledge each other as acting conscientiously. This universal identity falls apart into the non-identity of individual being for self. Each consciousness is just as much simply reflected out of its universality into itself. As a result, the antithesis of individuality to other individuals and to the universal inevitably comes on the scene, and we have to consider this relationship and its movement. In other words, this universality and duty have the very opposite significance of the specific individuality that exempts itself from the universal, for which pure duty is only a universality that appears on the surface and is turned outwards. Duty is only a matter of words and counts as a being for another. Conscience, which in the first instance is only negatively directed against duty as this given specific duty, knows itself to be free from it, but since it fills the empty duty with a specific content from itself, it is positively aware that it, as this particular self, makes the content. Its pure self, as an empty knowing, is something devoid of content and determination. The content which it gives to that knowing is taken from its own self, as this specific self is taken from itself as a natural individuality. And in speaking of the conscientiousness of its action, it may well be aware of its pure self, but in the purpose of its action, a purpose with an actual content, it is aware of itself as this particular individual and is conscious of the antithesis between what it is for itself and what it is for others, of the antithesis of universality or duty, and its reflection out of universality into itself. Paragraph 659 represents a turning back to the active, the acting consciousness, the one who is trying to act in accordance with conscience. And there's a contrast here to what was developed in the previous paragraph, the shape of the beautiful soul who does not act precisely so as to not besmirch itself by engaging in particularity, you might say. And so we're coming back now to looking at, well, what happens when you do, in fact, take some sort of stand? What happens when you do, in fact, follow your conscience? Does the equilibrium of acknowledgement in language that we attained up to this point, does that actually provide us with anything? And the answer in this paragraph is no. So he begins by talking about this silent fusion of pithless, that's heartless, essentialities of the evaporated life has to be taken in the other meaning of the actuality of conscience and the manifestation of its movement. Conscience has to be considered as acting. Now, what does it mean to be considered as acting? So the word here is handeln, right? The verb not just to act, but to comport oneself. So it's not just doing a single thing. It's a line of behavior, and we could call this an orientation. We could call this intentional action, if you like. And Hegel is going to use a phrase in two different ways running throughout this paragraph that's worth bringing up. So we've got this theme, we can call it, of reflection out of universality into its self. And he brings this up midway through and at the very end. So at the very end, he says that in speaking of the conscientiousness of its action, it may well be aware of its pure self, but in the purpose of its action, a purpose with an actual content, which we're going to get to in a bit, it is aware of itself as this particular individual and is conscious of the antithesis between what it is for itself and what it is for others, of the antithesis of universality or duty and its reflection out of universality into itself. Its reflection out of universality into itself is being opposed here to duty. So something is happening. On the side of the universal, that's the side of duty, something is happening that is a reflection. And Hegel is using the Latinate term reflexion, right? He's not using any sort of German term for this. He also uses a verbal form of it, reflektieren, a little bit earlier, so we should take a look at that passage as well. He says, the knowledge that knows itself is, qua this particular self, distinct from other selves. The language in which all reciprocally acknowledge each other as acting conscientiously, this universal identity, falls apart into the non-identity of individual being for itself. Each consciousness is just as much simply reflected out of its universality into itself. Now, in that point, he's not talking about universality without any qualifier. He says seine, its universality, right? So in the previous paragraphs, we saw that the conscientious individual, the person who's acting in accordance with conscience, can view themselves as acting in accordance with the universal, as in a certain sense embodying it. And there was also this sense of community to the point where we could actually have like a religious object in the community, and it was reinforced with language. Here things are now breaking apart through this reflection into itself. So what is this reflection? What is going on here? We should look at this as a sort of focusing on one's own self in an opposition to others and to the universality. And this has to happen when we act, right? We've seen this dynamic play itself out many times before in this section of morality, but also earlier. Whenever you act as a particular person, and your action never completely coincides with the universal. As a matter of fact, it may go against it in some cases. But if you don't act, then there's, all this talk about obligation or duty, Pflicht, all this talking about purpose, Zweck, all this talk about, all the other components that go into duty, morality, obligation. None of them really mean anything if we don't act. And so we're faced with this almost tragic situation. We have to act, and in doing so, we go against the universal. But if we don't, then we're just a beautiful soul. We don't want to be that either. So let's take a look now at this entire passage. He says, the objective moment, the gegenständliche moment in this consciousness acquired above the determination of a universal consciousness. Then he goes on, he says, the knowledge that knows itself is, qua this particular self, distinct from other selves. We've already just brought that up. So knowing yourself, knowing, willing, acting, speaking, we saw earlier that these all go together in moral or intentional action. So knowing here is not just a pure abstract wissen, a knowing that has only reference to understanding the world. It's also about knowing one's duties, knowing one's relations to others, understanding perhaps means and ends, what's required in the situation. And that particularizes or individuates a person, a consciousness from other consciousnesses, right? It's distinct from other selves. And all of this, the language where there's reciprocal acknowledgement, universal identity falls apart into a non-identity of being for self. So what does he mean there, a non-identity of being for self? Well, there's different ways of understanding being for self. It can be understood as sort of reflexivity. It can also be understood in a way that you might call Sartrean, although Sartre is really just picking this up. Hegel's already talking about this here, where there's a disunity a disjunction within the self itself, right? The self is taking a stand on itself, not simply in a pure harmony or unity, but as, saying, oh, wow, here's a trivial example of it. Past Greg didn't shoot these videos when he should have, and now that bastard has got me doing extra work at this point in time. There's a disunity there, right? Or I can think, am I really up to engaging in this mode of action that I've decided upon, those uncertainties? Those are all just examples. I don't want you to take those as being the paradigms for it. Let's go on. So he says that... Here we go. As a result, the antithesis, or you can say opposition, again, Gegensatz. He's been using this quite a bit in this section. Gegensatz, not exactly the same thing as antithesis, the way that sometimes gets brought up, but it does mean opposition, right? An antithesis enters in or is introduced, literally steps in. And you can say, well, what space is it stepping into? We could figure that out later. And what is the opposition between? The individual, Einzelheit, right? The one who is on their own, the one who is identifiable, and we might even say responsible, right? Who can say, I do this, I choose this. And two other sets of things. No, they're not things, right? Other individuals, anderen Einzelnen, right? So this is an opposition between oneself and others who are, in some respect, like oneself. But it's also a opposition or antithesis to the universal. And he uses two different words there, allgemeine, Allgemeinheit, right? I don't think we have to worry too much about the distinction there. I don't think Hegel's trying to make any point with the shift in terminology. But what is important here is that this universal is what was supposed to bring together the individual and all the other individuals, the other self-consciousnesses, right? So now we have an opposition where there's a movement against, a pushing away, a disjunction, the Gegen and the Gegensatz, right? And so he goes on, this antithesis inevitably comes on the scene, and we have to consider this relationship and its movement. In other words, this universality and duty, so duty is on this side, have the very opposite significance of the specific individuality that exempts itself from the universality. And here, he's going to be, he's going to be using different terms that we'll get to in a moment. So it exempts itself from the universal. How does it exempt itself? Well, pure duty is only a universality that appears on the surface, it's superficial, and is turned outward. Duty, here's an interesting thing to say, is only a matter of words and counts as a being for another. So only a matter of words. Liegt nur in den Worten. Well, of course it is only a matter of words. It lies in language, in Sprache or Rede, in the thing that allowed us to hit this medium that allowed us to have the universal, to see ourselves in the universal, to be with other people and recognized. Now that's no longer the case. So the individual here acting is going to reject this being for another that was attained in there. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Well, that remains to be seen. So he says, conscience, which in the first instance is only negatively directed against duty as this given specific duty. So there's an earlier stage where I have to act, I have to particularize the duty that I'm engaged in. And again, we saw this work itself out many times in the morality section. We saw this in other parts of spirit. We saw this in other parts of reason, right, where we're considering moral duties. Duty per se is a kind of bloodless, abstract conception. My actual duties that I have, when I try to do them, seem to come out against duty per se, or against other specific duties that other specific individuals might have. And now, he says, we go beyond this only negative. He says, how so? We know ourselves to be free from duty as such. How do we do that? We fill the empty conception of duty, the empty duty he's calling it here, but the empty notion of duty with a specific content. Where are we getting this content from? From ourselves. It's not simply imposed on us from on high or told us by, the people we've internalized as whatever you want to call it, something like the Freudian superego, these voices nattering in our head, be a good boy, be a good girl, do this, do that, right? No, it's not coming from anything like that. This is Gewissen. This is conscience. And the conscientious individual says, I can act on my own. I can give myself duties. I can recognize that, and it's going to come out of my own perspective, where I happen to be. I don't have to wait around for somebody to tell me what to do. I can figure it out and thereby act. So he goes on here, and this is where we get some of these other qualifiers. He says, it's positively aware that it, as this particular self, makes the content. In its pure self, as an empty knowing, is devoid of content and determination. So it's leaving that behind. That's over here on this side with the universal and the other individualities. The content which it gives to that knowing is taken from its own self as this specific self, and then here he goes on, is taken from itself as a natural individuality. And here he uses the word Individualität, not Einzelnheit. Is there a significance there? Well, maybe to some degree. The individuality that is natural is, the very body that I have, the drives, the desires that I have, the inclinations that I have, the specificity of me. And we could say it also extends to our spatial location and our place in not just time, but in narratives and history and within social structures. All of these things, that what makes me, not just me as an individuality, but makes me as the person I am within a social matrix. All of that is where I'm getting my content from my action. And not just from my action, but also, as we're going to see, well, let's go on a little bit further. So he says, in speaking of the conscientiousness of its action, it may well be aware of its pure self, but in the purpose of its action, a purpose with an actual content, it is aware of itself as this particular individual. Right? So we have, content for knowing what I'm going to do, knowing what I should do, knowing why I'm justifying it as what I ought to do. But the purpose, the point, the goal, the intentionality of it belongs to me and is coming out of me. I become aware of myself as this particular individual, conscious of the antithesis between what it is for itself, how it relates itself to itself, and what it is for others. And in some respect, you could say it either doesn't care about what it is for others, or says what it is for others doesn't really matter in terms of its own intentionality, or perhaps it even just goes against it deliberately, right? Maybe there is that gegen, against, in there, an opposition. So here he then closes by saying the antithesis of universality or duty, right, what's over here on this side, and its reflection out of universality into itself. So now we have, fuller understanding of what this reflection into itself consists of. It means looking at its own life, situation, mentality, and getting positive content for what it's going to do as an acting consciousness, acting in accordance with conscience from that. While in this way the antithesis into which conscience enters when it acts expresses itself in its inner being, the antithesis is at the same time a disparity on its outer side in the element of existence, the disparity of its particular individuality in relation to another individual. Its particularity consists in the fact that the two moments constituting its consciousness, the self and the in itself, are held to be unequal in value within it, a disparity in which they are so determined that the certainty of itself is the essential being in face of the in itself, or the universal, which counts only as a moment. In contrast to this internal determination, there thus stands the element of existence or universal consciousness, for which the essential being is rather universality, duty, while individuality, on the other hand, which is in contrast to the universal, is for itself, counts only as a superseded moment. For the consciousness which holds firmly to duty, the first consciousness counts as evil because of the disparity between its inner being and the universal, and since at the same time this first consciousness declares its action to be in conformity with itself, to be duty and conscientiousness, it is held by the universal consciousness to be hypocrisy. Paragraph 660 also deals with the acting consciousness or acting conscience, the Gewissen, that engages in intentional action, action that could be repeated, action that could be in some way justified, not a mere act, a tat, but rather handeln, comportment, behavior. And it's going to be shifting focus now to looking at how other consciousnesses look at this, rather self-contained, self-sufficient, self-justifying conscience that is engaging in action. And the way that it's ultimately going to frame this is in terms of evil and hypocrisy. So how do we get there? So he tells us, while in this way the antithesis into which conscience enters when it acts expresses itself in its inner being, right? So let's pause on that. This opposition or antithesis, Gegensatz, into which conscience enters when it acts. So in the previous paragraph, we explored this. It has to do something. It has to take some particular concrete stand, some sort of choice, decision, doing something, attempting something at least. It might not actually be successful in what it does, but there is some particularization. And this arises not just as a negative opposition to a universal duty, but as drawing positive content out of itself and its own motivational structure, its purposes, right? So this happens on the part of acting consciousness and conscience, and there's something being expressed in its inner being, within itself, you could say, within its consciousness, in that domain. And so then he says, the antithesis is at the same time something external. It's a disparity on its outer side in the element of existence. He uses the word elementa there. The element of Dasein, of, being, existing, wirklich, acting, actual beings. So we have not just an individual who has a certain conflict within themselves or some sort of unreconciled contradiction, you could say, but there's also something going on in relation to other individualities. And we saw this in the previous paragraph, right? There is an opposition not just to the universal, but to other individualities. Now the other individuality, speaking in place of the universal, gets to say some things back to this consciousness. And so disparity, Ungleichheit, they're not equal to each other. There's some sort of discrepancy, a discordance between them. And he says, its particularity, now we're coming back to the first consciousness, consists in the fact that the two moments constituting its consciousness, the self and the in itself, are held to be unequal in value within it. So there's a disparity or, unequalness, maybe even an uncomparability within the two as well. So there's a inner expression of this contradiction between the in itself, the an sich, right, and the self. And so we could say, is this between the in itself and the for itself? Yes, but Hegel doesn't talk about that here. He just says the self. And what is the an sich, the in itself? It's the universal that it has, along with everybody else, sort of implanted within itself. And then it has its own inner being as an acting subject. And it prioritizes the inner being. It says, I don't have to actually go by the universal. I've got what I need in myself to make the right decisions, to do the right things, to, go back to this conception of knowing, willing, acting, speaking. It can do all of those on its own. So he says that they're held to be unequal. It's a disparity in which they're so determined that the certainty of itself, so here's something very important, right? We should dwell on this for a bit. Conscience, in this entire section, is supposed to be certain of itself, right? So that's important for conscience or Gewissen. Attaining certainty is also something absolutely important within the Hegelian dialectic. We have this constant interplay between certainty and truth. And you start out generally from the position of certainty. You think you know something, you're very confident about something, and then you see how it plays itself out. And when you attain the truth of it, the certainty has been diminished, weakened, left behind. And a new certainty has to be established. Is that what we're doing here? Is that what we've achieved finally at this point in conscience? Well, to a certain degree, yes. Looking ahead, right? So the certainty is lying on the side of the self, not on the side of the universal. And so the certainty of itself, he says, is the essential being in face of the in itself or the universal, which counts only as a moment, right? It matters only in relation to what is giving it, you might say, a place to live rent-free in its head, right? The way that we talk about these things today. The universal is granted a kind of space or validity only insofar as it's related here to the self, which means that if it goes against what the self has decided to do, so much the worse for the universal, right? Too bad. We leave the universal behind, or perhaps we keep it along with us, but we're kind of stuck with it. Now, that's what's going on inside and being translated into an externality, which now stands against other externalities who represent the universal. And he says here we go, in contrast to this internal determination, there thus stands the element of existence. And what is this element of existence? Universal consciousness. Everybody else, the rest of society, or at least, some people who present themselves as those who get to speak on behalf of the universal. And this could be, quite sociologically conditioned. It might be a certain class. It might be, people who have, made themselves the center and leaders of this. It might be certain other people. Think about the role of, priests or bards in societies where they didn't rule, but actually had a considerable amount of, let's call it, cultural capital, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be every single, person in society is against this other individuality. As a matter of fact, it could even be the amorphous they that we encounter in Heidegger or, in other places, this notion of there being this kind of amorphous public opinion or average everyday consciousness, whatever we want to call it. But, now it gets to have a say. So he tells us that, here we go. In contrast to this internal determination, there's the element of existence or universal consciousness. How does that look at it? The essential being is rather universality, duty. Now notice how Hegel phrased that there. So universal consciousness, what is essential for it? The universal. It's kind of engaging in the same self-assertion, is it not? this often gets overlooked as the individual is engaging in self-assertion. It's sort of like conscience writ large, and it consolidates, what's essential into this notion of duty, obligation, plicht, what is required, moral norm, we could say. But as we've seen, this is a rather abstract conception of duty. As soon as we start to translate it into anything, we run into all sorts of antinomies. So he goes on and he says, here we go. Individuality, on the other hand, which in contrast to the universal is for itself, is counted only as a superseded moment. So from the perspective of the universal and the individuals who represent or embody or are captivated by the universal, this individuality is supposed to be superseded, aufgehoben, right? It's supposed to orient itself. Actually, let's talk about another term that we often use to translate aufheben, right? Sublation. It should be carried under the universal. That's the way that the universal looks at it. So how then is it going to regard the universal's self-assertion and deprioritization of the universal within itself? It's claiming to listen to the voice of conscience, but the voice of conscience is not the universal in itself. It is the self asserting itself. So he goes on and he says, for the consciousness which holds firmly to duty, the consciousness that looks at things through the eyes of the universal, the first consciousness counts as evil. Why? Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting. It's not evil just because, well, you're transgressing this moral norm which has been established by the universal consciousness and you're behaving badly in an external way. That is evil in one sense, but that's not what Hegel says here. He says it's evil because it doesn't recognize, it does recognize, but doesn't give the right value to the in itself, within it, the universal that all of us share in, right? So you don't listen to proper conscience. You listen to your own screwed up conscience, which isn't even really conscience from the perspective of the universal. And so that's what makes it evil in this case. And now, the other consciousness, the first consciousness, gets to respond and say, I am actually doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm following conscience. I am, going through this entire development of action, particularization, intention. And so he says, the first consciousness declares its action to be in conformity with itself. Now, notice he goes a little bit further. To be duty and conscientiousness. And so the universal consciousness gets the last word here and says, you're not just evil, you're actually a hypocrite. You are putting on airs. You are misappropriating the very language and concepts so that you can make yourself feel good about your evil intention or mindset and individual behavior going against the moral norm. You're actually trying to assume the mantle of duty against duty. So you're a hypocrite. Evil and a hypocrite. That's how the acting consciousness is going to be identified by other acting consciousnesses who, in a certain respect, are less developed at this point than the person who is conscientious.